leader takes the responsibility of creating an environment in which people feel they can be their best. With this quote by author and inspirational speaker Simon Sinek, let us begin this engaging episode of the Economic Times Cutting Chai Stories, brought to you by ET Edge. The key to cutting chai conversations is to have a valuable discussion around the areas of the early life of our guest speaker, their education and training, business sense, skills augmentation, and work-life balance. We also try and get a sense of what CXOs of companies like to do when they're not in CXO mode. This is your host, Deipti Dewan, and I shall be striking a conversation with our guest. Today we have with us Apoorv Kumar, co-founder and CTO, Refyne Finance. Refyne Finance is India's first and Asia's largest earned wage access platform. Previously, Apoorv has been associated with Shubh Loans, Goldman Sachs, and Qualcomm. He started his journey with Refyne to create a social impact within India's rapidly progressing fintech space by understanding people and their needs and delivering simple and efficient tools to meet them. So let's get to know the man himself, Apoorv Kumar. Welcome, Apoorv.
Hi, Deipti. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Cutting Chai Stories. Let's get started. So we'll take you back to the early years. Tell us about your childhood, your school days, and any instances or early life lessons that you recall during your childhood that are valuable for you today.
Yeah, so I think all of us tend to get molded quite a bit during our early childhood and the school days. In fact, a lot of the social traits that we pick up tend to come from there, and my story is not very different. So come from a very small town. I was born in Ranchi, went to an even smaller town, Singrauli, which is a coal mining area, coal mining and power generation. And being brought up in a small town gives you certain perspectives because the entire locality tends to be very close together. You basically know everyone around you. The entire colony is very close together, and that has certain positives, certain negative aspects as well, because everyone knows you. Information tends to get spread out very easily. So when you do well, everyone gets to know about it, and when you don't do well, even that is basically public knowledge. So, and then that tends to be a pattern in smaller towns, in smaller locations. And because of that, I was not a particularly good student early on in my career, and I was still trying to figure out what are the things that really interested me. I was very, very deep into science. I would spend a ton of time just neck deep into encyclopedias and trying to gain as much knowledge from it as I can, not so much into the academics or even the co-curriculars at school. So, and that became widely known. So that was the origin where I was particularly keen on certain areas which were particularly to do on the science side. The other thing I was very particularly keen on was languages. So at that point, most of the intellectual literature that you read are written in English. So English became the lingua franca for that. But slightly later on in my schooling, probably around when I was 12, 13, I got exposed to computers. Was very lucky that my dad got a computer for me, and I had basically a carte blanche on whatever books I needed. That's something my parents have always been supportive about. So I was able to get my first set of programming books, and once you get a sensation of being able to create something from scratch, that is just unparalleled, and that's where majority of my career started developing. I got introduced to computer programming languages, created my first game, and since then it's been just a love story with the entire science of computers and programming.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So I think you got the lessons in being a team player very early on in life. The fact that you mentioned that you were around a close-knit community, and also you discovered your passion and creativity that early. So thank you for sharing that. We move on to your college days now. You studied at IIT Guwahati, where you received your Bachelor's of Computer Science, and you were part of the coding club. So tell us about these days. What were these days like, and any instances or learnings that you recall during your college days that have shaped you as a person?
Actually, my majority of my learning on the teamwork side happened in the college. So growing up, I just quickly connected with my upbringing. Growing up, I was the only kid, and therefore you never have that sense of brotherhood, having that sibling. It adds a dimension to your understanding of relationships, which I did not have, and I was working with friends, but that one aspect got to learn slightly later in my journey. And I was very, very comfortable working alone. In fact, fortunately, unfortunately, a big part of Indian education system trains you for that, where all the academics, it seems like, is designed to get you into a room, get into a book, and then gain knowledge from there. So that was the case with me as well. Later on in the college, I took the same traits. I felt like all I had to do was just get in a room, study, and that would be the end of it. One thing I was very particular about is that I was keen on academics and I wanted to get some research work done while I was at college. And that was supposed to be the foundation for my future decisions, whether it was in research or in industry. I started working on a particular project. In my first year itself, when people were trying to figure out which branch that they want to continue in and if they want to change something, I have been lucky to have decided that I wanted to be in the area of computer science and mathematics very early on in my career. So after that, it's more around what I want to do in that particular area rather than which field to pick in the first place. So in the first year, I was fairly confident about, yes, I want to pick something very, very novel, do some research on it, and try to come up with something a very meaningful piece of research on it. And I reached out to a professor. I convinced her that even in my first year that she can give me a research project and I can start working on it. Interestingly, I gave everything I had to that particular research project. I spent vacations working on it. And ultimately, at the end of in my third year, I got to realize what had happened there. So I went into the work of into the mode of operating solo and trying to deliver that all by myself. And then I got to realize that when you try to reach or try to solve a problem of a particular complexity, it cannot be done alone. You absolutely need right team members. You need people to bounce ideas off of, and you need those brainstorming capabilities that you do with a particular team. And that was my key takeaway. I learned quite a bit from IITs. In fact, there are so many smart people. It becomes an amazing experience just being around them. But absolutely, hands down, my key learning from college was that you can't make big things happen all by yourself. And the first thing you should try to do whenever you try to embark on a very meaningful, a very impactful journey is to figure out who your teammates are going to be. So the entire experience of finding the right team, trying to achieve a big goal, comes from doing it the wrong way, then realizing that yes, that's not the right approach and it needs to be done alongside a team, particularly with people with complementary skill sets. If everyone brings the same sort of knowledge base and the same thought process to the table, it's still better than having no one. But a complementary skill set oriented team tends to achieve so much more.
Absolutely. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about this. So, talking about your leadership style and team building style, you've mentioned, and I quote, I personally ensure an environment in which each member of the team can achieve their best. Could you elaborate on that for our viewers, please? And how do you create this environment? And tell us more about your team skills and leadership skills.
Yeah. So, my leadership skills actually start from my first job, where I was absolutely not fit for a leadership role. So I was able to convince some senior team members. I was able to communicate well. So I was able to convince them that I might as well start managing a few folks not in a very formal management position, but definitely taking on a lot of responsibility in that direction. And this is where I started to learn how wrong my thought process was in terms of leadership. So the way I approached it early on is that I was good technically. In fact, I was able to handle very, very technically challenging problems, and that had been my strength from the past. That is why I was able to get into Goldman through the entire rigorous process. And I was around similarly smart people who were technically very, very sound. So my approach tended to be that, yes, you have to be technically very sound. Once you have figured out the technology piece of it or the technical side of it, then you start working on how you can scale it up, how you can work on the processes around it. And then finally, once you have the entire ecosystem figured out in terms of how to make things happen, then you figure out who are the right people or how you can go about achieving it. And it was just completely wrong. So what happened is, it was the first time me trying to mentor very, very smart people. Previously, it was more of a peer relationship where I was in college, everyone is a peer, or maybe even the juniors, right? So it's not much of a strong mentor relationship there. Yes, you can guide people, but here it's a professional environment where you have to achieve certain goals. And this is where things come to the fore. So early on, my leadership style was not particularly conducive to making great things happen. Yes, I was able to guide people technically, but that's obviously not enough. When you want people to be able to deliver their level best, you have to empower them uh, to achieve great things. And yes, you have to be a guiding force wherever required. But the point of working with very, very smart people is that they tend to figure things out on their own. Even if you are not the right person guiding them, I've seen a lot of managers who aren't incredibly good technically themselves, but they empower their team well enough that the team just goes out there and figures out the answer. So your personal technical ability, yes, it does help you build a certain level of respect from your team, but that's a very, very small element. Ultimately, it becomes about how do you empower your team properly. Towards the later part of my career, and then this is where I realized, and my current leadership style comes from, is that my entire ordering was incorrect. First thing you have to start with is people. Everything starts with that. Are the people motivated, inspired to achieve that particular mission? Um, do they feel like they have the right tools? Do they feel like they are personally inclined or have that conviction to make things happen? This is where everything begins if you are embarking on a particularly challenging journey. The second thing you have to figure out is the processes. You have to have processes to empower these people to deliver their level best and make sure that everyone is working in the same direction. They're completely aligned. And then comes the technical piece. So my original leadership style, which was start with technical details, work on the process, and then figure out the people, was completely turned upside down. And that's my current style, is that I try to work more closely with the people. I try to empower them with the right processes. And ultimately, together, we figured out the right set of technology and the technical details.
Absolutely. Very well said there. And thank you for sharing that with our viewers. A very well motivated team and inspired team can indeed do wonders. And throughout your journey, Apoorva, are there any moments that you remember in particular that you would like to share with our viewers? It could be a success story, it could be a learning, it could be a failure which has taught you a lot. Anything in brief that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. One thing I wish I had done better throughout my life was learn from other people's mistakes, and had a much stronger mentorship around me during my early phase of the career. So a lot of my learnings come from me making those mistakes, which is not the most efficient way, but it's a reasonable way to learn. So starting from my school days, one particular incident that comes to mind is, like I mentioned, I wasn't a particularly good student academically. And there was one math exam where I had scored something like 60, 61, something like that. And um, in school, you tend to have this habit of going to the teacher and start to haggle for a few marks here and there, because it's all partial marks, right? It's subjective. It's a question worth 6 marks. Now it's subjective as to how much you should get. The teacher has a particular opinion. You want to try to get some extra out of it, right? And that's what I was doing. I went to my maths teacher. I told him, sir, I think I deserve a little more here, a little more there. So I ultimately, he told me, okay, how much do you need? How much do you want? I said, sir, I feel like I can get 64 instead of 61. He said, like, he cut 61, he made it 64. There you go. I'm happy to give you this score. In fact, if you had given me a different number, I would have immediately given you that as well. But ask yourself this question at the end of the day: is this what you really deserve? And ultimately, I mean, that was one of the most profound things that I ever received in my life. Ultimately, what I realized from that is you have to be your own critic. The teacher is not the critic there. The teacher is just helping you evaluate as to how you can improve, have some feedback, but you have to critique yourself as to where you want to be and set the standards for yourself. Those scores mean absolutely nothing. They're just one of the ways in which you can help benchmark yourself, but unless you have those standards for yourself, you're not headed anywhere. And even if you don't score particularly well, but if you are holding yourself to very high standards in general, you can achieve pretty remarkable things. So that was one of my key learnings early on in my life. And since then, I think it wasn't an immediate change. It took some time for it to sink in as to what he was trying to say. It was a pretty impactful statement and a pretty impactful experience. But unlike in movies, that change does not happen overnight. It takes a few years for that entire concept to sink in you, to realize how to proceed from there on. And since then, one thing I've always held within myself is constantly trying to critique myself, trying to set benchmarks which are fairly high, and helps me create a direction for myself as to how I can improve. I think that was one of the most meaningful and impactful incidents in my life growing up.
Absolutely. It sounds like it. Thank you so much for sharing that anecdote with us. And we quickly move on to the next question, which is, we would like to know, how have you invested in yourself to keep improving your skills? Well, we do know that you like to keep honing your expertise and you like to experiment with different tech projects. But would you like to elaborate a little bit on this?
Sure. So I'm an engineer at heart. I still love programming. I still like, although a lot of my role has become around the company and how we are thinking about the business model and how we are going to build a team around it, I still enjoy that child in me is still there, which enjoys engineering and then the science around the engineering. So I try to take out as much time as I can trying to study new concepts. But again, that's a small element of it. The entire startup life pushes you to learn much faster than what you would typically. It's not even an option at the end of the day. If you are not, because the company is growing so fast, the only way you can try to keep up with the company is by constantly upgrading yourself. And the challenge, you don't have to go around looking for those challenges. They just present themselves day after day. Personally, what I try to do is have a very logical framework of how I measure what I'm trying to achieve and whether I have been able to achieve those things or not. One of the most influential frameworks that I have come across is the objectives and key results framework. So you have a particular objective that you want to achieve. Now you need to be able to measure it. The only things that you can improve in yourself or even around you are the things that you can measure. Otherwise, things tend to become very subjective, and ultimately it's becomes individuals call on whether that objective has been achieved or not. So that's what I try to do in my own personal goals as well, that I have a particular objective that I'm trying to achieve, and I come up with proper results as to how will I determine whether I have achieved those goals or not. I constantly work on the 3 elements that I talked about. I constantly work on how can I get better with people skills, how can I connect better with people? How can I inspire them better? All of these are skills that can be improved with practice, is what I have learned. I work on how can I learn new processes which are being used out there. What are the gold standards? What are other companies which have managed to scale very, very well with great culture? What are the processes that they are using at this point? And I connect with a lot of industry leaders trying to understand their perspective on how they have built teams and how they have built the processes around it. And like I said, technology comes from the inside. So I still continue to enjoy that piece of my life where I study technology, study engineering, study math, and try to continuously get better at that as well.
All right. Now, Apoorv, on a lighter note, quickly tell us about your hobbies and interests and how do you maintain work-life balance? Well, you do seem to enjoy backpacking across countries. That does sound exhilarating and I'm sure very enriching. So quickly tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So coming from a hardcore engineering background, there is a natural inclination towards being in a shell. You have a natural inclination towards being an introvert. Although a lot of my college friends who were very, very strong technically did have those people skills and were not particularly introverted, I was. So early on in my career, the only way for me to get out of my shell was to go solo backpacking. I figured that if you're in a completely unknown place where very few people speak the language that you are speaking, the only way to survive there is probably talk to people who other fellow travelers. So that is where all of it started. And then I think it's one of the most life-changing experiences I've ever done, is going backpacking, trying to meet new people from different cultures, trying to get their perspectives about and how they live their lives. And you try, one thing that it teaches you is that different perspectives tend to coexist very, very peacefully. There is no one perspective that is necessarily right or even very, very efficient, right? There are multiple very, very efficient perspectives. People are very, very happy in their own cultures with very different origins from my own, with very different approaches that they have taken compared to my own culture. And things turned out pretty well for them as well. And that is one of the key aspects I learned, which I am able to utilize while we are growing as a startup, is that we empower different perspectives. We love having people on the table who have come from very different mindsets. Whether some people come with a very engineering oriented mindset, some people think harder about the customer, some people think harder about the growth of the company or the broader picture and the vision that we are trying to follow. So we try to get all of these perspectives, and all of it was validated much early on in my life when I started backpacking. I tried to early on in my career, I tried to cover at least 2 countries every year. Now it's definitely slowed down with a lot of time going into building this entire category of earned wage access. Category creation can be very, very hard. So a lot of my time goes into that. But in terms of work-life balance, I will not try to sugarcoat it in any way. Early startup founder life can get very, very intense. Early on, because the responsibilities and the duty towards the company, and more importantly, duty for the people who have trusted you in this journey, it's pretty. It's a very important thing in your life, and you want to do whatever you can as long as you are able to maintain your sanity. So the best I do right now is that take some time off during the weekend to replenish, and so I can just deliver my level best in the next week. But yeah, the work can be stressful and it can get very, very intense, but it's all for a good cause, and it's an amazing journey. Just like what I experienced during backpacking. Even backpacking can get intense, it can be very, very tiring, but it's a beautiful journey nonetheless.
Absolutely. And it teaches you so much. Well, thank you so much, Apoorv, for sharing your experiences and for this very engaging conversation. It has been a pleasure knowing you and hearing from you. And to all our viewers, thank you so much. We hope that you have enjoyed and been inspired by this episode. Keep watching Economic Times, Cutting Chai Stories.